I thought this forge was empty, but it already knew my family name.
No room, no job, no family willing to answer, just a canvas pack and $9 she had earned sorting scrap after midnight. And with that $9, she bought a cast-iron andiron forge outside Hopewell Furnace, Berks County, Pennsylvania, where the lane vanished from maps in 1957. The north wall leaned 4 inches. Rain entered through the chimney shoulder. The county condemned the shop on October 3, 2022, with demolition planned for early spring. Inside its ruined bellows stood a brass nozzle with a sealed hollow core, unopened for generations, holding the means to alter every remaining year of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Della Ruth Mercer had been bracing her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in rentals where windows swelled shut each August and opened by themselves in January. At 8, she learned to warm socks over a toaster without scorching them. At 12, she could tell from her mother's key whether supper would be quiet. Only a blue enamel bowl followed every move, wrapped in newspaper and nested in the next cupboard. Her mother, Lorna, worked the returns counter and came home smelling of cardboard and rain. When trouble came, her hands found small, clean tasks. She wiped counters already clean and folded towels into hard rectangles. She did not lie often, but silence served nearly as well. Her grandfather, Amos Mercer, showed Della what steadiness looked like. A pattern maker and molder, he had shaped fireplace dogs, stove doors, and grate bars for foundries along the Schuylkill. Every Saturday, he collected her before sunrise in a truck with one gray fender. They stopped for coffee and a plain donut, then drove to his shed where he taught her that a wooden pattern needed draft to lift cleanly from sand. She swept, rubbed beeswax into handles, and listened while he tapped old castings with a light hammer. A clear ring meant sound iron. A dead note meant a hidden fault. By noon, they ate cellar apples and repaired whatever the week had loosened. A bellows hinge, a split flask, a warped molding board. Amos never hurried metal. Haste, he said, entered a casting as water entered a roof through a place too small to notice until winter. Make the part that bears the fire strongest. He meant andirons, but also knees, backs, promises, and the private places where a life carries weight without applause. Amos died in March 2018 after a stroke took his speech. While Della sat beside him at Reading Hospital, cousins cleared the shed. The tools went to auction, the pattern books disappeared, and his walnut chest was sold before she knew it had been opened. She received one object, a brass rule bent at 6 inches, his initials cut near the hinge. 4 years later, Della worked second shift at a Pottstown machine shop under Vernon Pike, a foreman whose shirts never wrinkled and whose voice stayed low because quiet commands traveled farther. He kept lockout keys inside his desk and treated missing guards as delays. On September 6th, a press brake cycled while Della cleared a misfed strip. Its guard had been tied back with a copper wire on Pike's instruction. The die crushed 2 fingers before another operator struck the emergency bar. Pike removed the wire before the ambulance came, then wrote that she had ignored procedure. By Monday, her badge no longer opened the door. The medical bill came first. The eviction followed on October 14, 2022. Her landlord set the blue bowl on the porch as though returning something borrowed. Della stood with her bandaged hand inside her coat while rain ticked against the awning. Lorna waited behind him, holding a dish towel folded once lengthwise. She had promised Della the couch for a week. Now she would not meet her eyes. "You cannot stay here. Your mother already decided." Exactly 8 words. The landlord placed Della's pack beside the bowl. Lorna smoothed the towel against her palm. She did not say yes or no. Della fitted the bowl into the pack and walked toward the bus shelter without closing the flap. For 6 weeks she moved by the cheapest routes. In Norristown she slept beside a laundromat exhaust vent until the owner found her at dawn and left coffee. In Reading she spent 3 nights upright in the transportation center, waking when security shoes crossed the tile. She paid $12 for a hostel bed in Allentown, then watched $43 become $27, $16, and $11. She washed in library restrooms, bought gauze 1 roll at a time, and learned which church vestibules stayed unlocked. In Boyertown, sleet hissed through the sycamores while she slept beneath a park shelter. By then, she had $9 and a few telephone coins. On a gray Monday, she entered the Boyertown Community Library to warm her fingers over a radiator. A classified sheet lay beside the copier beneath notices for firewood and rabbit hutches. One advertisement had been circled in pencil. Abandoned Andiron forge, tax title $9, buyer assumes all risk. Beneath it stood a clerk's number and a parcel location near Hopewell Furnace. Della read it twice, then opened Amos's bent rule across the address, as though 6 damaged inches could measure the distance between foolishness and shelter. At 4, she spent her telephone coins calling the clerk. At 5, she bought a bus ticket toward Elverson, keeping $1 folded inside the rule. She boarded with the blue bowl knocking softly in her pack. By nightfall, Della was traveling toward a condemned forge that knew her family name. The bus left Della at Elverson before dawn, beneath a lamp that gave the wet pavement the color of old tin. She walked 9 miles with her injured hand tucked against her ribs, following Route 23 until the traffic thinned and the farms began. By noon, her boots had rubbed the skin from both heels. She slept that night in a hay barn north of Joanna, inside a hollow where the bales had settled, while the temperature fell to 28 degrees. Mice moved beneath the straw. Each time she woke, she checked that the brass rule was still inside her coat. Morning came white with frost. She ate half a bruised apple left in a roadside crate and walked the remaining distance toward the borough offices, passing a low town that seemed to have gathered along the road for warmth. There was Harlan's Hardware beneath a striped awning, Doris Vale's Cafe with 3 pies turning slowly in a glass case, Eby's Feed and Seed behind a leaning corn sign, Miller's Barber Shop with 1 chair visible through the window in the Hopewell Pharmacy, where a red neon mortar flickered though the sun had risen. The county clerk's annex occupied a former bank with limestone steps worn shallow at the center. Della climbed them sideways because her left heel had begun to bleed. Inside, heat clicked through cast-iron radiators and the air smelled of paper, floor wax, and the wool coats of people who had already gone. A woman sat behind a walnut counter entering figures into a ledger with a fountain pen. One lens of her spectacles was thicker than the other, making her right eye appear watchful and enormous. Before her stood a brass nameplate, Mrs. Helen Wirtz Deputy. Clerk Della gave her name and the parcel number from the classified sheet. Mrs. Wirtz stopped writing. "You came on foot? Most of it." The clerk studied the canvas pack, the swollen bandage, and the mud-drying pail along Della's trousers. Then she opened a drawer and removed a brown file tied with cotton tape. "You understand the structure has been condemned?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no electric service?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the well has not been certified since 1969? "Yes, ma'am." "And you understand the county will not refund $9 when the roof falls in?" Della looked at the legal description, though the words blurred where rain had entered the old file. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Wirtz untied the tape. "That was 4 warnings. Most people leave after the second. Most people have somewhere else to leave for." The clerk's large eye lowered to Della's hand. She did not ask what had happened. Instead, she brought out a deed, a bottle of blue-black ink, and a wooden ruler polished dark by use. Della signed carefully, lifting the pen between letters because 2 fingers would not bend. Mrs. Wirtz dusted the page with blotting sand, shook it clean, then pressed a heavy brass stamp over the lower corner. Its jaws closed with the clean authority of a trap. $9. Della laid 8 worn bills on the counter, then unfolded the last from inside Amos's rule. The clerk smoothed it once and held it against the light. "Keep the rule," she said. "The county only asked for money." She placed the stamped deed in a manila envelope and drew directions on its back. Park Road south past the cemetery. Left at the split-rail fence. Follow the gravel lane after the state boundary marker. If she reached the Furnace Visitor Road, she had gone too far. Then Mrs. Wirtz looked again at the signature. "Mercer," she said. Della waited. "Any relation to Amos Mercer?" The question entered the room without warning, softer than the radiators ticking. "He was my grandfather." Mrs. Wirtz removed her spectacles and folded them over the ledger. Without the thick lens, both eyes looked tired and nearly the same size. "He used to file instruments here." "Easements, shop transfers." Once a lien release written on the back of a feed invoice because a man would have lost his house by morning. She rubbed the bridge of her nose. He came every Thursday for nearly 30 years. Sat in that chair and sharpened my pencils while he waited. Della turned. The chair was oak, plain, except for a crescent worn into one arm. He never said anything about owning a forge. No, he would not have. Mrs. Wirtz retied the file, though the knot did not need tightening. The property belonged to a woman named Lenora Mercer. Your grandfather paid the taxes after she died, until 2018. Then no one did. Della felt the brass rule against her hip. Who was Lenora? The clerk opened another ledger and ran one finger down a column. His aunt, according to the transfer. Perhaps more than that in practice. The old families used fewer words for such things. Did he know the place was still standing? Mrs. Wirtz looked toward the frosted windows. He kept it from being sold. That was all she would say. She slipped the receipt into her desk drawer rather than the cash box, leaving Della's final dollar beneath the paperweight. Then she gave Della a cup of water and 2 adhesive bandages from her handbag. By noon, the clouds had lowered over Park Road. Della walked beside stone walls furred with moss, passing fields where corn stubble rattled in the wind. Near the cemetery, an elderly man in green coveralls was splitting kindling beside a mailbox marked Klein. A red hound watched from beneath his porch, one ear folded wrong. "You headed to the Mercer place?" the man called. Della nodded. The hound rose and barked once. "Name's Otis, dog's Wick." The man rested both hands on his maul. His beard was yellow-white and cut square beneath the chin. Lanes muddy past the walnuts. "Stay to the crown. Thank you." He looked at the envelope under her arm. "You bought it, then, for $9. Otis glanced toward the wooded rise. "About right." The lane began beyond a split-rail fence and narrowed between black walnut trees. Their fallen husks broke beneath Della's boots with a medicinal smell, sharp and green despite the cold. At the crest, she saw the forge. It was not a cottage, as she had imagined from the clerk's directions, but a long stone workshop joined to a smaller dwelling under one sagging roof. The main block measured perhaps 30 feet by 40, built of local fieldstone with brick repairs around the openings. Cedar shingles had peeled back along the north slope. A square chimney leaned above the ridge, its upper courses softened by weather. Over the door hung an iron sign suspended from one chain. Mercer Andiron Works. The final word lay upside down against the stone. Della stood in the walnut leaves until the wind pressed through her coat. Then she fitted the county key into the lock. The door opened 6 inches and struck something inside. She lowered her shoulder and pushed until a wooden crate scraped across the floor. Cold air came out first, carrying old soot, mouse nests, damp leather, and the mineral smell of stone that had not held a fire in years. The front room had once been the sales and pattern space. A counter leaned beneath a row of empty shelves. Iron dogs stood in pairs along the wall. Setters, mastiffs. 2 lions with worn faces, all scaled with rust. When Della crossed the boards, dust rose bitter on her tongue. Somewhere above, rainwater gathered and fell with a slow metallic plink into a bucket. The back room was larger and darker. Her boots found cinders under the dust. A masonry firepot occupied the center wall, its opening choked with gray ash. Beside it sagged the enormous double bellows, the leather split into curled plates, its wooden ribs exposed like those of a stranded animal. The brass nozzle disappeared into the forge throat. Della laid her palm against it. The metal held a deeper cold than the room. She found a hand pump behind the building, but its handle moved without drawing water. The outhouse door had fallen inward. There was no bed, only a horsehair mattress folded behind the front counter and gnawed open at one corner. Before dark, she carried the crate away from the door, swept a place near the chimney, and spread her coat over the least damaged section of mattress. She ate the remaining half of the apple. Its flesh had browned, but the sweetness remained near the core. Night settled without electric light. The building changed around her as the temperature dropped. Boards clicked. Something small scratched inside the wall and went still when she moved. From the forge room came the smell of iron and cold ash, heavy enough to taste. She placed the blue bowl beside her head and the deed beneath it, then listened to the walnut branches drag their fingers over the roof. Long after midnight, wind entered through the broken chimney shoulder and passed through the dead bellows. The leather gave a low, exhausted sigh. Della opened her eyes. The forge sounded as though it had been waiting to breathe. What bears the fire does not have to burn with it. Della began with water. On the first morning she removed the pump head, laid its rusted bolts in the blue bowl, and found the leather cup inside the cylinder curled hard as bark. She soaked it in rainwater, rubbed it with cooking oil from the bottom of her pack, and worked the handle until brown water coughed from the spout. She pumped 20 minutes more before the stream ran clear enough to fill a jar. She boiled it anyway. The outhouse required less delicacy. She lifted the fallen door, braced it with a cedar strip, and swept out 3 seasons of leaves. By the third day, she knew which floorboard complained near the counter, which a stair tread shifted beneath the heel, and where to step at night without waking the whole building. The forge was teaching her its weak places one sound at a time. She walked into town on the 4th morning with the brass nozzle measurements written on the back of the county envelope. Harlan's hardware smelled of kerosene, sisal rope, and the peppermints kept in a jar beside the register. Narrow aisles rose to the ceiling. Tin funnels hung above coal scuttles, and every drawer bore a label written in the same patient hand. The owner stood on a rolling ladder sorting hinge screws. He was a broad man with 1 white eyebrow and 1 black, a mismatch that made every expression look unfinished. "Elias Harlan," he said, coming down. "You are the $9 woman, Della Mercer, I know." He examined the bandage on her hand, but addressed the list. "You cannot clean a chimney with hope. I was planning to use a brush. That is already better." She placed her remaining coins on the counter. Elias counted them, then pushed 2 back. "What can you do for $7? "Very little," she said. "What can you do next month?" "I do not know." He opened a ledger bound in cracked green cloth. "Your grandfather paid every account before winter. I can extend the courtesy once. I cannot promise a date, then promise you will not disappear." Della looked toward the window where sleet had begun to mark the glass. "I will not disappear." He wrote Mercer Forge at the top of a clean page and handed her a thin book with a water-stained cover. "Home repairs for farm and shop, 1949 edition. Free," he said. "The advice is old, but gravity has not changed." She bought a 6-inch wire chimney brush for $3, 50 feet of sash cord for $1.85, a pound of stove cement for 65 cents, 2 lamp wicks for 18 cents, and a packet of pump leathers for 90 cents. Elias added a used scraper without entering it in the ledger. Back at the forge, Della tied the brush to the sash cord and climbed onto the roof by way of a walnut ladder lying under the eaves. The upper rungs bowed, so she tested each one before trusting her weight. At the chimney, she removed the rain cap, lowered the brush until it struck a hard shelf, then pulled it up with both hands. Black flakes rattled down the flue. The shelf was glazed to creosote, dense and shining where smoke had cooled against the masonry. She wrapped a chain around the brush head to add weight, worked it downward in strokes no longer than a foot, and stopped whenever the cord began to saw against the brick edge. Twice she descended to rake loosened soot from the firebox. The third time, a mass of creosote fell with the sound of crockery breaking and covered her boots to the ankles. She worked 5 hours the first day and 4 the next. The chimney yielded 1.5 bushels of soot, 2 bird nests, and the iron buckle from a long-rotted harness. When a mirror held inside the firebox caught an unbroken circle of daylight, she sealed the cracked, clean-out door with stove cement and waited overnight. The first fire was no larger than her 2 hands. She burned twisted newspaper, then walnut twigs, then 3 dry splits Otis Klein had left against the door without a note. Smoke climbed cleanly. The draw strengthened with each minute, lifting ash from the grate in pale spirals. Della set a dented saucepan over the coals and cooked oats with half an apple cut thin. Steam dampened her face. The room did not become warm, not truly, but a small ring of heat reached her knees. She ate from the blue bowl while the chimney carried smoke above the roof for the first time in decades. Afterward, she entered the workroom with a lamp. The place revealed itself by circles. First came a pair of molding flasks stacked beneath the bench, their alignment pins green with corrosion. Then a lion head pattern carved in sugar pine, one ear repaired with a square peg. A row of hand files hung above a vise, each wrapped at the tang with faded red thread. There was a bent pouring shank, a box of blacking brushes, 2 iron riddles for screening sand, and a wooden strike-off bar worn hollow at its center. Near the rear wall stood 6 andiron bodies without shanks, their dog faces blank beneath soot. The bellows occupied nearly a quarter of the room. Its upper board was ash, 5 feet long and thick enough to resist warping. The leather had failed along every fold, but the ribs remained joined. At the nose, a brass pipe narrowed into a flared nozzle nearly 14 inches across, larger than any hand-forged tuyere Della had seen. She cleaned around it before touching it. Using the scraper, she lifted compacted ash from the masonry throat and found 3 square bolts holding the nozzle collar. 2 turned after soaking in lamp oil. The third required heat from a candle and the careful pressure of Amos's bent rule beneath the wrench handle. When it broke free, the sound traveled through the pipe with a low double note. Della stopped. She tapped the nozzle with the scraper. The outer rim answered bright. 6 inches farther back, the tone went dull. She tapped again. Bright. Bright. Dead. The nozzle should have been hollow from bellows to fire. She held the lamp behind it, but no light came through. Then she removed the collar and tried to lift the assembly. For brass of that size, it weighed too much. Not by a pound or 2. By 20. She set it on the bench, rolled it once, and heard something shift inside with a slow wooden scrape. At the narrow end, she found a seam disguised beneath the soot and polishing compound. The seam circled a disc of cedar fitted inside the brass wall, its grain darkened almost black. 3 tiny holes formed a triangle near the edge. Della made a pin from a cut nail, pressed each hole in turn, and felt a spring release beneath the third. The cedar disc rose the thickness of a fingernail. She did not pry it quickly. She worked the scraper around the edge, lifting a fraction at a time until the seal gave with the dry breath of old resin. Cedar scent entered the room, clean and sudden. Inside the nozzle was a second chamber, lined with oiled canvas. Della carried the lamp closer. The first package was wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with linen cord. She loosened the knot rather than cutting it. Within lay 3 heirloom tools: a small pattern maker's compass, a curved gate knife for cutting channels and sand, and a 6-ounce molder's hammer with Amos Mercer stamped beneath the face. She held the hammer by its walnut handle. The wood bore the shallow oval worn by his thumb. Beneath the tools rested 4 bars of raw metal wrapped separately: gray iron, nickel, chromium, and a narrow steel bar marked for grate shanks. A folded booklet lay between them, its cover titled Heat and Corrosion Notes. The pages contained ratios written in Amos's hand, with temperatures and cooling times entered beside small sketches of dogs, lions, and leaf-shaped feet. At the bottom sat a tin box no larger than a loaf pan. Della lifted it onto the bench. It had no lock. The lid resisted until she warmed the rim near the fire, then opened with a soft snap. Packets filled the box from side to side, each bound in bank paper gone yellow at the folds. She removed them one at a time. The first held $10 gold eagles. The second contained $20 Liberty double eagles. There were silver Morgan dollars, worn piece dollars, and a narrow roll of Barber half dollars. A cloth pouch held smaller coins mixed with black walnut dust. Beneath the money lay a bronze victory medal marked 1918. Its rainbow ribbon faded nearly white. The final object was wrapped in cotton. It was a miniature andiron in the shape of a seated hound, scarcely 3 inches high, cast in solid gold. Its front paws were square, its back straight, its face calm before an imagined fire. Della counted the cash on the floor because the bench had begun to feel too narrow for it. She made columns on the deed envelope, checking each packet twice. Gold first, silver second. Paper certificates folded under the tray. When she finished, the total was $34,800 exactly. The figure did not seem to belong in the room. It was larger than the hospital bill, larger than a year's wages, larger than every amount she had ever been asked to imagine. Yet it lay before her in careful rows, quiet as hardware. A sealed letter remained beneath the tin tray. Her name was not written on it. Only one word appeared across the front: Keep her eye, Della placed the coins back in their packets, set the metal beside the gold hound, and returned everything except the letter to the nozzle chamber. She fitted the cedar disc loosely over the opening but did not engage the spring. The letter stayed on the blue bowl through supper. She did not read it. When darkness came, Della carried her coat behind the forge and followed the ground downhill until she heard water moving beyond the walnut roots. A narrow creek crossed the meadow, black under the November sky. She sat on a stone and watched reflected stars break, mend, and break again in the current. Behind her, smoke rose from the repaired chimney in one straight column. What bears the fire does not have to burn with it. At first light, Della set the blue bowl on the workbench and broke the envelope seal with the gate knife. The paper inside had been folded into thirds and pressed flat beneath weight. Before she read a word, she knew the hand. Amos had taught her letters by copying labels from pattern boxes, and this was the same narrow script, each capital leaning forward as though carrying something. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened this, then the brass throat has chosen patience over force, and that is the first thing I hope to learn about you. My name is Amos Elijah Mercer. In May of 2017, Dr. Miriam Cole at Reading Hospital told me I had an aggressive cancer of the pancreas. She gave me months, perhaps a year. I had already been silent about this shop for more than 30 years, and illness did not make the silence easier to explain. The work began with Silas Mercer, born in 1819 near Hopewell Furnace, who cast our stoveplates and plain fire dogs until the panic of 1857 closed his first shop. His son Jacob carried the patterns to Birdsboro and reopened in 1866 after returning from the Civil War with 2 fingers missing from his left hand. Jacob's daughter, Lenora, born in 1878, brought the shop back to this property in 1901 and made the lion and hound forms lighter without weakening their feet. Her nephew, Thomas Mercer, my father, worked here until September 17, 1983, the exact day Mercer Andiron Works closed. I was the 4th generation to know the molds and the first to let the fire go cold. My older brother Samuel was killed in Korea in 1951. He had been meant to inherit the forge. After the telegram came, my father entered the shop each morning but stopped teaching. By the time he was ready to speak again, I had learned to keep my own questions quiet. Silence became habit, then wall, then roof. The notes with this letter are not magic, they are work. For great shanks, keep the steel above 1050 degrees Fahrenheit before bending and normalize it slowly so the shoulder does not crack. For the corrosion mix, add chromium at roughly 2 1/2 parts to every 100 parts of gray iron, with nickel at 1 part, no more. Ram the sand firm at the feet and lighter around the ears. Bent each mold twice along the back and let a finished casting cool in sand for at least 12 hours before lifting it. The small gold hound is not for sale unless hunger leaves you no other choice. It is a model of what we tried to make, a support that remains itself while holding burning weight. Inheritance is not the money, though money may keep rain off you. It is knowing where to place your hands, how long to wait, and what must be strengthened before heat arrives. Use only what you need. Keep the rest for someone who reaches this place with less than you had. I failed to reopen the shop. I kept the taxes paid because I could not bear to watch it torn down, and because I believed a stranger might one day enter without entitlement and listen before claiming anything. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Amos Elijah Mercer, October 2nd, 2017. Della read the letter once standing, then again seated on the floor with her back against the cold firebox. On the second reading, she stopped at Samuel's name and pressed the paper flat with her palm. When she finished, she folded it along the old creases, exact edge to exact edge, and returned it to the envelope. The back door stuck against swollen boards. Della opened it with her shoulder and stepped into a yard silvered by frost. Amos had written one word in the margin beside Lenora's name: East Marker. She walked beyond the pump toward the walnut trees, counting 12 paces from the foundation. There, half buried beneath leaves, stood a short fieldstone post with a carved hound on its face. Moss filled the cuts. At its base lay a rusted iron ring and 3 white stones arranged in a line. She knelt and cleared the leaves with both hands. The marker faced the forge window, not the road. Inside, Della chose the oldest object she could safely use, a whale oil lamp with a cracked tin reflector and a wick hardened into a black thread. She trimmed it square, threaded one of Elias Harlan's new wicks through the burner, and filled the reservoir with lamp oil. The flame caught low, then steadied. Its light touched the hound patterns, the brass nozzle, and Amos's hammer without softening any of them. She thought of the people who had helped without knowing the whole of her need. The laundromat owner in Norristown who had left coffee beside the vent and walked away before she woke. Mrs. Wirtz who had kept the final dollar in her desk and given her bandages without questions. Otis Klein, whose 3 walnut splits had made the first hot meal possible. Elias Harlan, writing credit into a ledger beside a name he had trusted before she was born. There are kindnesses so small that the giver may forget them by supper, while the receiver carries them for years. What is one small kindness someone once gave you when you needed it most? Tell us in the comments, not to praise the giver, but to keep that act moving. That night, Della laid the compass, gate knife, and Mulder's hammer beside the mattress. She put the letter beneath the blue bowl and the gold hound inside it. The lamp burned on the floor until the room warmed enough for the brass to lose its frost. When she slept, her hand rested near Amos's hammer, not touching it, but close enough to know where it was. The first snow came on December 2nd, 4 inches laid quietly over the walnut roots and the sagging roof. Della read the roofing chapter in the old repair manual 3 times, once by lamplight, once beside the chimney, and once standing outside with the book held open against the wind. The roof measured 28 feet by 36. Allowing for overlap and waste, she calculated 24 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of felt, and 11 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Elias Harlan frowned at the figures, corrected one multiplication, and brought a roofing hatchet from beneath the counter. Its blade was narrow, its gauge notch worn bright. "My brother's," he said. "He will not ask for it back." Otis Klein arrived the next morning carrying a coil of rope and wearing a canvas coat polished at the elbows. He had roofed barns for 32 years before his knees stopped forgiving ladders. "I cannot pay you," Della said. "Then do not waste my daylight." They stripped the north slope first. Beneath the rotten shingles, one rafter had split beside a knot. Otis showed her how to sister it with a soundboard, clamped tight and bolted beyond the fracture. They snapped a chalk line across the felt, blue dust lifting in the cold, and worked upward by courses. Della learned his 3-stroke method. Set the nail, drive it nearly home, finish flush without bruising the shingle. "That nail's proud." She bent close, pull it. On the 6th day, sleet glazed the ladder. On the 9th, wind tore a strip of felt loose and sent it into the walnuts like a black flag. They retrieved it, trimmed the split edge, and began again. 11 days after the first shingle came off, Della set the final ridge cap in place. By mid-December, rain no longer entered the north room. January exposed what the first fire had hidden. Bricks above the smoke shelf had begun to spall, their faces flaking away in thin red scales, while mortar at the rear joint powdered beneath Della's thumb. She dismantled only what she could rebuild before dark. Elias mixed advice with lime on the back of a seed invoice. 2 parts sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, and enough fire clay to make up 1/4 of the binder near the flue. Della soaked each sound brick before setting it so the masonry would not pull moisture too quickly from the joint. For 3 weeks, the temperature stayed in the 20s. She worked in fingerless wool gloves until mortar caught in the fibers, then used bare hands for the final tooling. Every 15 minutes, her fingertips went numb. She warmed them over a candle, flexed them once, and returned to the wall. One morning, a repaired course settled out of line. She removed 6 bricks before the lime hardened and laid them again, slower, checking each face with the bent brass rule. The work left white burns along her knuckles and permanent dusting of gray in the seams of her coat. On January 29th, she built a test fire with newspaper, dry walnut, and 3 narrow splits. Smoke entered the throat, climbed without hesitation, and drew clean beyond the ridge. Outside, the plume stood pale against the frozen trees. Della watched until the last split settled into coals. The front room floor was white pine, though soot and old oil had darkened it nearly black. Hand-cut rose-head nails held the wider planks, their uneven crowns showing where generations of boots had passed. Della rented a random orbit sander from Harlan's for $14 a day. She drove each proud nail below the surface with Amos's molder's hammer, then made 3 passes, 80 grit to remove the hardened grime, 120 to level the scratches, and 220 to close the grain before oil. The machine pulled against her shoulders and filled the room with a resinous dust that smelled faintly of summer boards warmed in a barn. Where the first pass crossed the floor, pale wood emerged in long islands. By the third, the planks had begun to show their original figure. She rubbed in the first oil coat with cotton rags, waited overnight, then applied the second and third more thinly. The floor required 48 hours to cure. As the oil sank in, the color shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, deepest around the rosehead nails. One morning she woke with both hands stiff and the noise of the sander already waiting inside her head. She carried no tools outside. At the marsh below the creek, a great blue heron stood in shallow water, one leg folded, its body motionless beneath a lowering sky. Della sat on the bank until noon. The bird lifted once, crossed the field with 3 deliberate wing beats, and disappeared beyond the walnuts. She did no work that day. The next morning she finished the final coat. There were 8 windows. 3 had no glass at all, 4 were cracked across their lower panes, and one held a wavering original pane dated to 1788 in a carpenter's notation cut into the sash. Della preserved that one exactly as it was, bubbles, distortion, and all. She removed the damaged sashes one at a time, labeling each weight pocket with chalk. The old cords had turned brittle and broke when bent. She replaced them with a 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot at the counterweight so it would not slip under load. For glazing, Elias sold her DAP 33 putty and showed her how to warm it between her palms before rolling it into narrow ropes. Della bedded each pane, pressed glazier's points into the wood with the edge of a putty knife, then drew the final bevel in one unbroken stroke. Where her hand hesitated, the putty showed it. She scraped those lines away and began again. The third window took most of a day because the lower rail had rotted beneath the paint. She cut a repair from straight-grained pine, scarfed it into the soundwood, and pinned it with 2 small brads before resetting the glass. By the final window, February light had begun to last past supper. Della lifted the sash into its opening, tied off the second weight, and tested the balance. It rose 6 inches and stayed. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch level with the glass. Its black cap shone against the snow. It turned its head once toward the room, then flew. Della lowered the sash carefully and set the latch. The walls near the chimney were horsehair plaster laid over hand-split oak lath, and they resisted Della's first repairs with an old wall's suspicion. 3 patches failed in succession. 1 cracked overnight. 1 sagged before noon. The third released from the lath in a single damp sheet and landed at her feet. Elias found an old paper sack of horsehair in the loft above his store, left from his father's time. Della mixed it into lime plaster until the fibers spread evenly through the batch. She pressed a scored scratch coat between the lath strips, waited until it held a thumbprint without yielding, then added a 3/8-inch brown coat and left it 72 hours to cure. The finished coat went on 1/8 inch thick, drawn smooth with a steel trowel dampened at the edge. At dusk, she stood before the repaired wall and saw no bulge, no hairline crack, only a pale surface drying toward the color of bone. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Vale began leaving paper bags on the doorstep each Tuesday before sunrise. She was a square-shouldered woman with flour caught permanently in the creases beside her thumbnails. The first bag held 2 biscuits, an egg sandwich, and a slice of apple pie wrapped in waxed paper. The second held soup in a jar and a note listing the jar's deposit as 0. Della carried the empty containers to the cafe and placed $3 beside the register. Doris pushed the money back with 1 knuckle. In candles when the shop reopens. She turned to the griddle before Della could answer. Caleb Klein arrived on a blue Schwinn one Saturday afternoon. A splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a fence rail with a cowlick that rose again whenever he pressed it down. Without asking, he split the walnut rounds Otis had left behind the forge, placing each finished piece beneath the eaves with the bark facing outward. Della offered him $2. He shook his head and rubbed his palms against his jeans. My mother said, "About your grandfather, that was all." He returned them all to his shoulder and rode home standing on the pedals. Reverend Boyd passed the lane each morning at 7:15, walking with a blackthorn cane and wearing the same brown felt hat in fair weather or rain. He never entered unless invited. He tipped the hat when smoke rose from the chimney, and once, seeing Della carry a cracked sash alone, held the door while she crossed the threshold. At the step, he touched 2 fingers to the brim, strength for today's work. Then he continued toward town, his cane sounding once on every other stone. Della postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door lay beneath the rear stair, swollen shut and colder than the rooms above. She freed it with wedges, descended 7 granite steps, and entered a 12 by 15-foot chamber floored in fieldstone. The air smelled of earth, apples long gone, and iron rust. At the center lay a dressed granite slab, unlike the rough stones around it. A craft mark had been carved into its face. A seated hound bearing a single flame between its shoulders. Della brushed the groove clean. She did not lift the slab. Under the 3rd stair, an oak box had been wedged behind a loose stone. It came free only after she removed the stair tread and pushed from beneath. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped into the same seated hound, along with a tintype wrapped in linen. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the forge in 1903. Her skirt was dark, her sleeves rolled, and one hand held a molder's rammer upright beside her boot. The resemblance was not exact, but it was enough to stop Della's breath. The woman had her eyes, the same square chin, and the same guarded set to the mouth. On the back, scratched through the varnish, were the words Lenora Mercer, daughter of Jacob, age 25, summer of 1903. Della carried the photograph upstairs and placed it beside Amos's letter. The key remained on the mantel above the repaired hearth. She did not know what it opened. The snow retreated first from the stone walls, then from the lane. The creek grew loud with meltwater, and green walnut catkins appeared where bare branches had scraped the roof all winter. Della cleaned the molds but did not charge the furnace. She read Amos's notes each evening and understood enough to know what she did not yet know. That spring she would not begin with a full andiron pair. She would spend 1 coin on materials, build small sand samples, and learn how gray iron moved at the edge of heat. She made test impressions from the lion ear and the hound paw, ruined both, and started again. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Della poured her first complete object. It was not large enough for a public hearth. The pattern measured 12 inches from paw to shoulder, a single hound meant to stand beside a small stove. She'd rammed the sand firm around the feet and lighter near the ears, cut 2 vents along the back, and watched the cupola until the iron ran with the smooth brightness Amos had described. Chromium and nickel went into the melt by weight, not instinct. She poured without interruption, waited 12 hours, then broke the mold at dawn. The casting emerged black and rough, with both ears intact. She filed the seam, fitted a heat-treated shank, and set the hound before the forge fire. It bore the weight of burning walnut without checking. By then the rooms no longer seemed repaired. They seemed inhabited. The white pine floor carried the dark sheen of oil and use. 8 windows held winter light. The chimney drew without smoke, and the plaster near it remained sound. Lenora's tintype stood on the mantel beside the gold hound, while Amos's tools occupied the wall where empty nails had waited. The brass key found its lock during a storm. Wind tore a dead limb from the largest walnut tree and exposed an iron plate bolted into the trunk where bark had grown around its edges. Della cleared the wet wood with a chisel and saw the seated hound stamped beside a narrow keyway. The brass key entered without resistance. Behind the plate was a cavity lined in tin. Inside lay a folded 48-star flag, dry despite the rain, and a note written by Lenora Mercer on April 8, 1918, while American troops were fighting in France. "Jacob is gone, and Samuel is not yet born," the note began. The names had shifted through the generations, but the work had not. Lenora wrote that her brother Matthew had sailed with the 28th Division, and that the flag had hung above the forge until news came that he had been killed near Chateau Thierry. She folded it before grief could turn it into decoration. The tree, she wrote, was alive and therefore a better keeper than a locked drawer. The note ended with instructions for whoever opened it, do not display this to prove sorrow. Carry the name where names are carried. On November 11, 2025, Della took the 1918 Victory Medal and Matthew Mercer's note to Hopewell Methodist Cemetery. Reverend Boyd met her beside the veterans' stones. They placed the medal beneath a small glass cover at the family marker, read the name once, and stood through the final minute of silence as wind moved the dry grass. Della spent 4 coins from the cash. 1 paid for refractory brick. 1 bought coke and foundry sand. A 3rd covered a used safety shield and leather apron. The 4th went toward a proper flue thermometer. She recorded each expense in Amos's booklet, including the date and the reason. The remaining money returned to the brass chamber. She wrapped the packets in fresh-oiled cloth, placed the gold hound above them, and added a note of her own beneath the cedar disc. For the next one, use only what keeps the roof sound and the work honest. The shop reopened without ceremony. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a piano lesson notice and a lost cat flyer. It read, Mercer Andiron work small fireplace fittings repaired. New work by request. No rush orders. The first request came from a widow in Birdsboro with a cracked grate bar. The second came from a family restoring a farmhouse stove. By March, Della kept a mailing list of 43 names in a school notebook, though she accepted only the work she could finish without hurrying. Caleb returned that spring carrying a board wrapped in an old feed sack. He had grown taller, and his blue Schwinn had been replaced by a truck that coughed twice before shutting off. He unwrapped a hand-carved sign made from walnut. The old iron sign still read, Mercer Andiron Works above the door. Caleb's board was narrower. Its letters had been cut deep and painted the color of lampblack. Daughters Della ran her thumb through the first ampersand. There were no daughters after Lenora, she said. Caleb shrugged, there are now. He had carved the plural deliberately. They mounted the board beneath the old sign, leaving enough space for rain to pass between them. From the lane, the words looked as though they had always belonged together. That night, Della opened a clean sheet of paper and placed Amos's letter beside it. The forge had cooled to a red bed of coals. A snowmelt ticked through the gutters, and the brass rule lay open across the desk at its bent 6-inch mark. She began, My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote that the roof would hold, the well required priming in dry weather, and the 3rd stair should be lifted from the left side. She described the sound of good iron beneath a light hammer and warned that grief could make a person hurry, even when the work required waiting. She did not explain every choice. Some knowledge needed hands, heat, and failure before words could become useful. Near the close, she added the sentence Amos had given her without ever writing it down. What bears the fire does not have to burn with it. Della folded the page but did not seal it. There would be more to add. Caleb's first proper mold, Doris's candle order the year the creek rose above the lower field, the day another young person arrived with no place left to go. Outside, evening gathered among the walnut trees. The restored hound stood beside the hearth with 1 paw in firelight and 1 in shadow. Della closed the draft, checked the latch, and left the letter beneath the blue bowl. The cast iron and iron forge waits. It has always waited. At the county clerk's annex, Mrs. Wirtz eventually retired. Her desk passed to a younger clerk who emptied the drawers, sharpened the pencils, and found an old dollar bill beneath a brass paperweight. Across its margin, in Helen Wirtz's small handwriting, were 4 words, Paid by Della Mercer. The clerk returned it to the drawer and closed it gently.